Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brycey, and the Old West Museum for having me. It is a real honor to be able to come here and speak at Frontier Days, which has a real connection to the women's suffrage movement, which I will talk about later, and also the descendants of some of the women I'm going to talk about are actually here today as well. So that is very exciting. And also, just on a personal note, thanks to all my friends and family who drove many, many long miles to come and see me today. So thank you, guys. All right, of course, driving long miles to see somebody is what you do in Wyoming, right? Okay, well, as Brycey said, I was born and raised in Wyoming, and I left when I was age 18 to go to college, which left a giant Wyoming-sized hole in my heart. And the way in which I fill that hole is by conducting research on women's suffrage. Because when I was in college, and I was a history major, obviously, I was taking lots of classes on the history of the United States, on the history of the American West, and I thought, growing up in Wyoming, that everybody knew that Wyoming was the first place to grant women the right to vote. Turns out not everybody knows that. And beyond that, of course, the women in the American West generally had the right to vote decades before women had the right to vote in other parts of the country. And so I feel like there's kind of a gap in our understanding of our history, and so this is kind of how I came to write about this. My kids would tell you it's an obsession, not just an interest or a hobby. They always joke that I have 3 kids, the 2 of them, and then Esther Morris is the 3rd. So. Okay, so I'm going to share with you today the results of some of my research, and for some of you who've grown up in Wyoming or know a lot about Wyoming suffrage, some of the story will be familiar, but I'm also going to share some things that I think I found in my research that are probably less familiar to folks. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So hopefully this is going to work. Yes, all right. So that is Philadelphia. That is not Wyoming. So I want to start tonight. As you know, this year we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, right? And I want to start off tonight by actually going back to the centennial of the Declaration of Independence in 1876. And so 1876 is only 11 years after the Civil War ends, right? So the country, Reconstruction is still going on. The country is still kind of torn apart. And so the federal government decides that the way they're going to try to bring the country together is by having a giant party in Philadelphia to celebrate the Declaration of Independence. And, you know, since it's the 250th anniversary, maybe you haven't read it in a while, I thought maybe we could take a quick look at it. I'm going to just read a couple of the key sentences here from the Declaration, okay? The first is probably the most famous sentence in American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Kind of our fundamental founding principle as a nation, right? This notion that we're all equal and that we all have the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in whatever way seems appropriate to us. Equally important, but perhaps slightly less well publicized, is the next sentence, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, okay? So why do we have government? To protect our rights. And where does that government get its legitimacy from? The consent of the governed. And in a democracy, the consent of the governed means the right to vote. So even as the Declaration of Independence is being written, there are some women, like Abigail Adams very famously, who raise their hand and they say, hey, what about us? When you guys create this new government, are you going to include women in it so that we can, be part of this, give our consent to being governed? Abigail Adams writes a letter to her husband asking that question, and he writes back saying, I cannot but laugh at this ridiculous idea that women should have the right to vote. And generally speaking, women had very different codes of laws that governed their behavior in early America. So women did not have access in particular to the same economic kinds of rights that men did. In particular, married women lived under this institution called coverture. So once you got married, your husband basically controlled any property, he controlled your wages, he had the right to tell you whether or not you could get a job. Basically, you were kind of covered by him, is literally what coverture means. And so women had many restrictions placed on them in terms of their economic rights, and of course there were no colleges that accepted women. You could not go out and get an education, become a lawyer, any of those kinds of things. And of course, also, there's another group of people in the United States at this time whose rights are severely restricted and are not able to pursue liberty, and that is, of course, the 800,000 enslaved individuals who are living in the United States at the time that the nation is created. So at the time that we have the Declaration of Independence, it's kind of a statement, an aspirational statement of what we would like to be in the future, but it is not kind of the reality for many people living in the United States. And the ink is not even dry before people begin raising their hands and pointing that out, okay, and saying, hey, we need to, if we're going to live up to these principles, we're going to have to take some action. Well, some of these conflicts, as we know, as I mentioned, 1876 is only 11 years after the Civil War. So the Civil War is a war that is sort of fundamentally fought about this question of slavery. And at the end of the Civil War, which some historians refer to as our second founding, where we kind of revisit this question of equality that we had put forward in the Declaration of Independence, Congress passes 3 constitutional amendments. The first is the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, except as punishment for a crime. And then we have the 14th and the 15th Amendments. So let's take a quick look at the 14th Amendment. All persons, are women people? Yeah, think so? Okay, all right. I feel like I'm a person, sure, okay. All right, all persons born or naturalized in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction of, are citizens. Okay, so are women citizens? Kind of seems like it, right? All right, good progress. Okay, so women are citizens. And of both of the U.S. and of the state where they live, no state shall make or enforce any law which abridges the privileges or immunities of citizens. Can't take my rights away. All right, nor shall any state deprive anybody of life, liberty, or property without due process. And you can't deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. So hey, that sounds pretty good, right? So now, if you read that, can we have separate laws for men and women, or do we have to have, the same kinds of laws for men and women? All right, I see a range of opinions. Well, some activists, including Susan B. Anthony, and I understand that the League of Women Voters here in Cheyenne is going to do a play about the trial of Susan B. Anthony on July 4th, and I think there's some information about that on the table back there. Some women looked at the 14th Amendment and they said, hey, you know what? This looks like this gives us rights. Let's go vote, okay? So Susan B. Anthony intentionally went out and voted and got herself arrested. And her case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And another woman in in Missouri, named Virginia Minor, also went out and got arrested for voting, and her case also went to the Supreme Court. And so the argument that those women made in their cases was, hey, 14th Amendment gives us the right to vote. And the Supreme Court said, nah, that's not what the intention of that law was, never mind. Another woman, who's actually a friend of Esther Morris by the name of Myra Bradwell, she wanted to be a lawyer. She did the qualifications that you needed to do in those days to become a lawyer, applied to the Bar of Illinois to become a lawyer, and they said no because there was a law in the book saying that only men could be lawyers. She said equal protection of the law, took that case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, nah. Can't do it. That's not what the intention of the 14th Amendment was. And in that ruling, they actually invoked God, and they said God did not want women to be lawyers. And so that was the end of that. So the hope with the passage of the 14th Amendment was that it would protect women's rights, and as we've seen by the mid-1870s, that strategy has kind of been shot down. And then, of course, we have the 15th Amendment, which is ratified in 1870, and it says, the rights of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this makes it so that I cannot discriminate against you in voting on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but can I discriminate against you on the basis of sex? Yes, I can. Okay, and the women's rights movement, it's a very long and complicated history about the 15th Amendment. They had tried to get sex included in the 15th Amendment. They were not able to do so. After the passage of the 15th Amendment, the women's rights movement then turned to a dual strategy, okay? So the two strategies, the first is to try to get a 16th Amendment passed, which would give the right to vote to women. It does eventually get passed, but by then it's the 19th Amendment, right? The other strategy is to turn to the territories and the states, and to try to get it to happen on the state level, and then have that influence the rest of the country so that suffrage passes. And that, of course, is where Wyoming comes into our story. All right, so that was kind of a detour from 1876. Let's go back to Philadelphia. All right, there we are. Now, like I said, this whole giant celebration is intended to kind of bring the whole country back together. So that is a picture of the Philadelphia Exposition, which was open for about 6 months, and they built all those buildings and had all kinds of exhibits about the arts and the sciences and all that sort of stuff. 10 million people came to Philadelphia during the 6 months it was open to visit the exposition. Women's rights organizations lobbied to get a building where they could display the achievements of American women and talk about the rights of American women. They did get a building, but it was a teeny tiny little one. You can't even see it on the map. It was kind of back there in the corner. So the women were kind of offended. And then the plan was for, on the 4th of July itself, the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or the publication of the Declaration of Independence, there was going to be a giant parade, and then there was going to be a big speakers platform where there were going to be all kinds of speeches given talking about, the Declaration of Independence. And so the national women's rights leaders, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they said, hey, you know what, we want to be there. We would like to be on the stage on that day, praising the Declaration of Independence on behalf of American women, but also asking for our rights as Americans. And the organizers were like, no, we are not letting you on the stage because you're just going to make it all about you, and it's not all about you, Susan. But you know what? We'll give you 5 tickets. And so you and 4 of your friends can come and see the speeches. And Susan's like, okay, I'll take those 5 tickets. And so then the 4th of July comes, all right, and the day starts with a giant parade marching all the way through Philadelphia. They get to Independence Hall where the Declaration was signed. The speakers are there, there's speeches, there's music, there's all that stuff. And then they bring out an original copy of the original of the Declaration of Independence, and one of the descendants of the signers reads it. And as they're reading it, as he ends, there's kind of this moment of silence as people think about the meaning of this document. And in that moment of silence, those 5 women who'd snuck in, they stand up, okay? And they stride up to the front of the platform. They climb onto the stage where the Vice President of the United States is sitting going, what is happening? And Susan B. Anthony hands to the Vice President of the United States a document. She then proceeds to come down the steps, march through the crowd, out the back, handing out flyers. The 5 women are handing out flyers as they go. The crowd is like, what's happening? They all stand up and they follow her. She goes to the other side of Independence Hall, commandeers a stage that had been put there for the musicians, and proceeds to read the document that she had handed to the Vice President of the United States. And this is the document. It is the Declaration of Rights of the Women of the United States and the Articles of Impeachment against the government of the United States. And it's quite a long document modeled on the Declaration in which they issue their complaints for having their rights not be recognized by the federal government. And I just have a brief quote from it there. Our faith is firm and unwavering in the broad principles of human rights proclaimed in 1776. Yet we cannot forget all women still suffer the degradation of disenfranchisement. Okay? So she kind of made her point. She basically hijacked the celebration, right? And it was in all the newspapers across the country. After she had finished reading this declaration, the women went a couple blocks away to a Unitarian church, a church that had a long and radical history. It had been associated with the abolition movement. And at this church, they intended to have a 1-hour meeting about women's suffrage, but so many people came, it turned into a 5-hour meeting. And there were many, many speakers speaking at that event. And what I want you to be able to notice is to look at the bottom of the second to last paragraph there, and you'll see that one of the speakers there that day is Wyoming's own Esther Morris, okay? So Esther Morris was a troublemaker, and I wanted to kind of start with this incident because I think it shows the importance, first of all, of Wyoming, because Esther Morris is the only woman at this event who actually has the ability to vote, okay? None of the other women who are there are able to vote. She can speak to the experience of what it's like to be a woman who votes. She's also the only woman in U.S. history up to that point who has held a judicial office, so she can speak about what it's like to be a woman and a public official as well, and what that experience was like for her, and also what she thinks the impact on her community has been. So Esther is there that day, she talks, she hangs around in Philadelphia for a couple weeks after that. Many more people kind of come to the offices of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and she spreads the word about the great state of Wyoming, which the suffrage activists always refer to as the first true republic. Elizabeth Cady Stanton always said that Wyoming was the only true democracy in the world because it was the only place where all people could vote, though not quite all people could vote, but certainly most people could vote. So the story of Wyoming suffrage starts with Esther. This is my favorite photograph of her because she's staring right at you, kind of asking, what are you doing with your life? What difference are you making in the world? I feel like this photo kind of really captures the intensity of her personality. So let me just tell you a little bit about her. She was born in Western New York in 1811 or 1812. She was born into a huge family, lots of brothers and sisters, but her parents died when she was 10, 11 years old. And so she was kind of raised by a combination of her older siblings and her grandparents, and because there were so many kids, I think she was kind of left to her own devices. So rather than doing the sort of typical thing, which was to get married when you're about 18, 20 years old, she actually started a business. She was a hat maker, a milliner. So she started a business where she made women's hats, and she was very successful at this business, so successful that she was able to make her own living. And she was not dependent on her family, and she was able to live independently, which is very unusual for a woman in this time period. Very, very atypical. Now, she did eventually get married when she was in her late 20s. She got married, she had a baby. Unfortunately, her husband died just a few months later, and so she was left alone, a widow, with a young toddler. Now, at that point, given that she's living in the community where she grew up and her extended family is around her, you would kind of expect that she would stay there, right? So she could raise her child with the support of her family around her. But not Esther, that's not what she does. She packs up, she gets on the train, and she moves to Illinois, specifically to Peru, Illinois, which is a town that had just been founded like a couple years ago. It's basically like a patch of dirt next to the river. She does this because her husband had been a railroad engineer, and he had a plot of land out there that he owned. So she went out there to claim that plot of land. Once she was there, she started another hat shop, made her living that way for a couple of years, and then she remarried. And the man she married was a Polish immigrant, a Jewish immigrant from Poland named John Morris. And they had 3 children. One of them died in infancy, and then she had 2 sons that survived to adulthood. Let me just show you very quickly her sons. So this is obviously when they're grown-ups, right? So on the left, her son, that's her oldest son from her first marriage, that is E.A. Slack. And those of you who know your Frontier Days history know that E.A. Slack is the guy who kind of came up with he's one of the people who came up with the idea of Frontier Days, so he's kind of considered the father of Frontier Days in some senses. It was partly at least his idea. Next to that, you have his brother, Robert Morris. Robert was also very important in Wyoming history. The public library in Cheyenne, if you've ever gone there, you owe that to Robert Morris, because he's the guy who brought the Carnegie Library system to Wyoming. It was actually the first Carnegie Library in the country, Robert Morris. He was also in the state legislature and was active in all kinds of political causes. And then you can't see him, but in kind of the upper right-hand corner is Esther's 3rd son, Ed Morris. That is the Wyoming Constitutional Convention. He was a member of that. He was also held various political offices. He was the Laramie County assessor for a while. He was the mayor of Green River. So these are her 3 sons who, once they come out to Wyoming, they stay here for most of the rest of their lives, and they're really important in the early economic and political development of the territory of Wyoming. And if you want to know more about them, we can talk about them afterwards. But for right now, I want to go back to Esther. I'm going to have her look at you again for a while here. All right. So One of the interesting questions that I've always had about Esther is why does she do this very unusual thing and leave her family in the 1840s and go out there to Illinois? It's partly the land, I think, but I think that there's another reason that I started kind of beginning to perceive as I dug more into the archives about her. And I think it's her politics. Esther in the 1830s becomes an abolitionist. And today, it may seem super obvious that slavery is a bad thing and we should abolish it, but it was not apparently obvious to Americans in the 1830s. And abolitionists were considered to be crazy radicals who were a danger to society and were sort of going to, cause, society to collapse, right? And of course, the abolition movement, does eventually lead to some of the tensions that lead to the Civil War. So, there's kind of a point there. Esther becomes very active in the abolitionist movement in the time before she marries her first husband. And there's a family story that is passed down about her that for a long time I thought might just be a story, but then I actually found some documentary evidence suggesting that this in fact really did happen. So I think that it's a more or less true story. So the story goes like this. Esther was in Owego, New York, the community where she grew up and where she had her business, and she was attending an abolitionist meeting at the local Baptist church, which is where the really radical abolitionists would hang out. And while this abolitionist meeting is going on, a torch-bearing mob of pro-slavery folks show up, and they say, you guys need to get out of the building because you guys are a bunch of radicals and we're going to burn the church down. And rather than leaving, Esther Morris, who was 6 feet tall, she stands up to her full height and she confronts these guys, this torch-bearing mob. And she said, well, if you're going to burn the church down, I'm going to stand here and watch you because this church belongs to the Baptist people and you don't have any right to destroy it. And that's a story, but I want you to think for a moment, like if you were in that situation and there's a torch-bearing mob of racists coming at you, would you have the courage to stand up to them? I mean, I don't know. None of us know that until we're actually in that situation, but Esther did have that courage, and I think she was, a pretty remarkable person in that sense. So, however, a lot of her family really disapproved of her political activism, and there was a lot of tension with some of the other members of her family, some of whom were elected officials, like in the New York legislature and things like that. So there were some people in her family who really, really were down on her for all of her political activism and for disgracing the family by not behaving like a proper lady. So I feel like this is one reason why she left New York and went to Illinois. And we know that when she was in Illinois, she continued her abolitionist activity. She's hanging out with a lot of abolitionists, people who are active in the Underground Railroad. I don't know if she's active in the Underground Railroad or not, but she certainly is associating with people who are. So that kind of brings us up to Esther's early life. When the Civil War breaks out, her oldest son joins the military. Her two youngest sons are still in school, so she stays in Illinois to get them their education. And her husband kind of sells up his business, and he starts to head west. He takes part in a gold rush in Idaho, and then once the Civil War is over, he hears that there's a gold rush happening here in Wyoming in South Pass City. So once the Civil War is over, John Morris and his stepson Archie, they head out and settle themselves in South Pass City. Now, Esther's two youngest sons are not at all excited about coming out to some dusty mining town in the middle of nowhere. And so they want to go to New York City, like where the action is, right? And so Ed and Robert and Esther actually head to New York City for several months. And this is a really important period in Esther's life because, like I told you, she has this gigantic family, right? And in New York, she has two nieces. And these two nieces are independent young women with jobs. And their job is working as typesetters on Susan B. Anthony's newspaper, The Revolution, okay? And the oldest niece, who Esther had helped raise, Esther was very, very close to this niece throughout their lives, she is Susan B. Anthony's private secretary. So she's the one who's in charge of organizing all the conventions, booking all the speaking dates, doing all this kind of stuff. So there's this period of about 9 months or so where Esther's kind of in New York, kind of hanging out with her nieces, who she sees very frequently. And I think this is the period. She'd always been a women's rights person. She'd always written about women's rights, but I think this is the period when she kind of gets tied deeply into the movement. And she's going to have a connection with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton for the rest of her life. Okay. All right, so eventually she gets tired of being in New York City, and I don't know the family politics that are involved, but eventually Esther and her two younger sons do head out. They end up, by the summer of 1869, in South Pass City in what is today central Wyoming. Now, when she gets there, like I said, she's just been hanging out with all these suffrage activists. So when she gets there, the territory of Wyoming is getting ready to have its very first election, okay? So it's going to elect the first legislature, and this legislature, their job is to create a code of laws for Wyoming. So Esther recognizes, okay, here is a good opportunity. And so she starts talking to all of the men who are running for office in the legislature. And in particular, she makes friends with the wife of that guy. His wife is named Julia Bright. William Bright is a Southerner. He had served in the Union Army, but he was originally from Virginia, and he did not believe that black men should have the right to vote. But he also recognized that that ship had kind of sailed because the 14th Amendment had been passed and the 15th Amendment was in the process of being ratified. So he did not believe that black men should have the right to vote, but he was persuaded by his wife and by Esther that if we're going to expand the right to vote, we may as well expand it to everybody. And so he became a supporter of women's suffrage, kind of for somewhat racist reasons, to be blunt, because he believed that the votes of white women would outnumber the votes of black men, right? And it's not just here in Wyoming that logic is used. You kind of see it in suffrage activism across the country, all the way up to the passage of the 19th Amendment. Okay, so William Bright, he says quite clearly, and I know there were some historians years ago who used to say Esther didn't really persuade the legislature. She absolutely did. There's tons of evidence that she did. Most importantly from William Bright himself, who gave lots of speeches saying that Esther was the reason that he introduced the suffrage bill. The way he expressed it is he said, she loaded me down with suffrage. So William Bright gets elected to the legislature. He then heads to Cheyenne. And when he gets to Cheyenne, he encounters more suffrage activists there. So the woman on the left is Anna Dickinson, who's kind of forgotten today, but in her time, she was one of the most famous women in America. She was a women's rights speaker for suffrage, but also for for women's economic rights, women's educational rights. She was a very powerful speaker. And she came through Cheyenne in September of 1869 and gave a speech in favor of women's rights. She was a close personal friend of Esther's nieces in New York, so I kind of feel like maybe the reason she was in Cheyenne was because of that connection, but I'm not really sure. In case you can't read it, the slogan underneath her photograph is her life slogan that she always said: "The world belongs to those who take it." Yours truly, Anna Dickinson, and I think that's a great slogan. The woman next to her is a woman by the name of Amalia Post, who lives here in Cheyenne and is also a suffrage activist. Her path to suffrage is kind of typical, I think, for women of the period. She had come west to Nebraska with her first husband. They had a baby. The baby died. And then the husband disappeared. He basically just left her in this sod house in Nebraska. She eventually tracked him down in Denver. She went to Denver. She found him living with another woman who was wearing Amalia's clothes. And so then he took off with her clothes and her money. So she had to get a divorce, which was very difficult to do in those days. You had to have like a whole trial and prove all these kinds of things. So she went through this very painful and difficult process and came out the other side of that as a firm believer in women's rights and the idea that women needed the right to vote so that they could change the laws so that they could protect themselves against these kinds of things happening. All right, so Amalia Post is probably attending the sessions of the legislature every day when they're meeting, because one of the first things they do at the legislature is they set aside a group of seats for ladies who wish to attend the legislature, and apparently women are coming every day and seeing what the legislature is up to. And it's a whole complicated story, but the long and short of it is that the Wyoming legislature does in fact pass the women's suffrage bill. But I want to point out that they also passed several other bills related to women's rights, which are extremely radical for the time. Not quite as radical as suffrage, but also pretty radical. So one is a divorce law. making it easier to get divorced and giving women close to equal rights in the divorce process. The second is an inheritance law, so that if your husband dies and you want to inherit its property, it makes it easier for you to do that. That's an experience that Esther herself had gone through. And then the third one is an equal pay law. It's an equal pay for teachers law. And this is something that Susan B. Anthony had been advocating for since the 1850s. And I am not totally sure of this yet, so maybe don't quote me, but I believe this is actually the first equal pay law in U.S. history. I've not found one earlier than this, but I haven't looked everywhere I should look. But it's certainly an early one, if not the first. All right, so suffrage passes in December of 1869. The guy on the left is Governor John Campbell. He's the guy who signs the suffrage bill, and the territorial secretary on the right-hand side, that's Edward Lee. I just want to mention him because I think that he's the guy who actually writes the bill. Both of these guys had served in the Union Army. They had very strong feelings about racial and gender equality. Lee had actually introduced a suffrage bill when he was in the Connecticut legislature. So my sense is that what happened is William Bright came to Cheyenne and said, hey, I want a suffrage bill, and Lee, could you write one for me since you've written one in the past? And so that's, I believe, the sequence of events that took place. So Lee's a suffrage supporter, Campbell's a suffrage supporter, Campbell signs it, yay, women have the right to vote. And also the right to hold office. So a couple of important things. So 1870 then is going to be a very big year for Wyoming women. So in March, in Laramie and then slightly later here in Cheyenne, women begin serving on juries. Okay, and this is not photographs of that. The picture on the right is a reenactment of that first woman jury. The picture on the left is a group of suffragists in 1919 standing in front of the spot where the jury met. So in Cheyenne and Laramie, you have women serving on juries, the first time in American history that women had done so. In February of 1870, Esther Morris, this is kind of the more well-known and famous photograph of her. Esther Morris is appointed as a judge in South Pass City, where she tries about 35 cases, about half civil, half criminal, and is widely seen as a very successful judge. And then the main event, we get to September 6th, 1870, which is the first time that women vote in Wyoming. And just in case anybody in the audience is from Utah, I want to acknowledge that Wyoming gives women the right to vote in December of 1869. Utah gives women the right to vote in January of 1870, and the Utah women actually vote in February of 1870. So Utah women do vote first. So we give the right first, but Utah actually exercises it first. But we have some other firsts that I'll tell you about here. So that woman, as you probably know if you grew up in Wyoming, is Louisa Swain. It was kind of decided that as she was an elder woman, she was going to be given the honor of being the first woman to vote in Wyoming. She voted in Laramie. There's a statue of her at the place where she voted on 2nd Street in Laramie. The other women who voted that day, I want to point out that Wyoming is the first place where I believe the first place in the United States where black women vote as well. Because as I was looking through the records, I kept seeing references to black women voting in September of 1870. And unfortunately, we do not have any records left from that election. So what I did is I actually read the entirety of the 1870 census, which was a little mind-numbing, but I did do it. And I was able to locate that at the time there were about 35 black women of age living in Wyoming, and under Wyoming suffrage law, they would have been eligible to vote. And we do have accounts of black women going to the polls that day. So unfortunately, I don't know specifically which black women voted, but I want to tell you about a couple of black women who are living in Wyoming at that time who I think may have been among the women who voted. So the first is Lucy Phillips, who I think you could consider to be one of the founding mothers of Cheyenne. She came into Cheyenne on the very first train that ever came here. She was born into slavery in Kentucky. After the Civil War, she and her husband, as did many African Americans, headed west to get away from the South for, obvious reasons. She and her husband settled here and lived here for the rest of their lives. They established a variety of businesses. And Lucy Phillips eventually made money and purchased a plot of land, which she then donated for the foundation of the Allen Chapel African Methodist Episcopalian Church, which is still in operation today. I went down there yesterday and was able to visit it, and they have a big photograph of Lucy Phillips, and they revere her as the founder. So the church is still operating now. It's either the first or the second African-American church in Wyoming, and has been in operation continuously since 1878. Lucy Phillips, again, I don't know for certain that she voted in 1870, but I know she was politically very active for the rest of her life. Here in Cheyenne, there were many black women's organizations and clubs that were very on the alert and active in political issues. So, for example, at some point in the 1870s, there was someone, a former Confederate from the South, who moved here to Cheyenne and whose kids were going to school in Granite Canyon, which is a stage stop outside of Cheyenne, and there was a school there. And this gentleman suggested that the school there should be segregated and that white children and black children should not attend the same school. And Lucy Phillips got word of this, and she wrote a very fiery letter to the newspaper run by Esther Morris's son, and said she wanted to know who it was that was proposing this, and if it went through, then she and the other black voters in Cheyenne would make sure that that person was never elected to any kind of public office ever again. And as far as I know, that proposal went nowhere. But there are also plenty of records of other black women's organizations here in Cheyenne through churches, through clubs, things like that. And it's pretty clear that they're an important part of the community, keeping an eye on the political goings-on. Another black woman who I think may have been one of the first voters is this woman, Nancy Phillips. She was living in South Pass at the time of the 1870 election. After leaving South Pass a couple years later, after South Pass kind of declined, she moved first to Bryan and then to Green River, where she spent the rest of her life. She and her husband operated a number of businesses there, and she worked as a midwife for the Green River community. So she was prominent also in community affairs in a whole variety of different ways, in a business sense and in a civil rights kind of sense as well. So I feel like it's possible that she also voted in the 1870 election. And also, I don't know if any of you sew, but look at that dress. Like, I mean, those, I don't know if you've ever tried to sew pleats like that, but they're incredibly difficult. It's like every kind of pleat. Like, it's a masterpiece, that dress. Okay, so I think, one of the things Wyoming is maybe doesn't talk about enough about, but I believe should be known for, is the first place in which politically enfranchised African-American women were able to exercise their right to vote. Okay, all right, just checking the time here. So just want to talk a little bit about some of the other women who served in public office in the territorial period. So in 1870 itself, women began organizing politically. So this is the Republican ticket for Laramie County here in Cheyenne in 1870. And you can see that there are 2 women running for office. So women have been enfranchised for not even a year, and they're already running for public office, right? And you can see that Amalia Post and Mrs. W.D. Pease, who had also served on one of the juries earlier in the spring, have infiltrated the county Republican committee. And I mean, when I say infiltrated, I mean that, because initially they started having their own women's Republicans meetings, and the men said, why don't you stop doing that and come over here, because they were getting a lot of attendance at the women's meetings, and the Republican men decided they needed to pull the women in. Now in 1870, women did not win in any of the races that they ran in. But in 1872, women ran for election again. In Laramie, a woman by the name of Eliza Boyd ran for county superintendent of schools, and she lost, but just by 38 votes, so it was a close election. But you can see here in Cheyenne, Melvina Hendry Arnold won her election. She crushed the opposition by almost 1,000 votes. And that makes her the first woman, fully enfranchised woman, ever to be elected in United States history. Okay, so a little bit of Cheyenne, a first for Cheyenne for you, Melvina Hendry Arnold. Women continued to politically organize throughout the 1870s and the 1880s. In 1873, in Laramie, the women of Albany County held a convention and they approved resolutions, and they nominated 2 candidates for the legislature, Esther Morris and Eliza Boyd, and they gave addresses from several leaders. And I want to just read to you a little bit from their resolutions. So the first resolution that I want to share with you from this meeting begins with a quotation from the Declaration of Independence. The truths to be self-evident, consent of the governed, the stuff we already talked about. And then they add this sentence at the end, and since all the natural and common necessities of woman are the same in kind as those of men, it follows, therefore, that all the natural and inalienable rights of man are necessarily the rights of woman. Okay? The next speaker at the meeting after that resolution was reached was Esther Morris, who stood up and gave a speech. And she was aware that there were many people who did not agree with the sentiment on the previous screen. So here's what she had to say. Heretofore, before this, women have not been considered capable of comprehending the nature of laws and governments. Man has looked upon her as too delicate, too refined in her nature to cope with the hardships of life, and therefore did not want her educated to grapple with them. Yeah, exactly. And she is basically paraphrasing things that if you read newspapers about people talking about why women shouldn't have the right to vote, that is exactly the stuff that they say, right? Women are too delicate to handle it. Here's what Esther has to say about that. These are the teachings of the past, and not entitled to the respect of a people whose government and religion are based on the principle of natural right or equality of mankind. So she brings it back to the Declaration of Independence again. So why are these women having all these meetings? Why are they doing all this organizing? Well, in 1871, there had been an attempt to repeal women's suffrage. If any of you guys know the story of that, it was almost succeeded. It actually passed the legislature. The governor vetoed it, and then the legislature tried to override the veto, and they were just 1 vote short. So there had been an effort to repeal women's suffrage, and just 1 vote saved it. So I think that the reason that these women are having all of these meetings and getting on all these committees in the early 1870s is to let the men know. Eyes on you. We are watching. You try to take our rights away again, you're going to have to, go through us first. We're not going to let that happen. And after kind of the late 1870s, you don't really see in the newspapers anymore any anti-woman suffrage sentiment. Kind of by then, everybody seems to have gotten used to it. And you begin to see increasing numbers of women getting elected. Okay, so these are women who follow in Esther Morris's footsteps, and they are elected as justices of the peace. Okay, now most of these women are, grangers in actual town at this period, but all of the other women here are in very small little ranching communities, so they're kind of out there on the ranch, and they're the justices of the peace for their ranch and the 2 or 3 ranches in the neighborhood. And a lot of these women are also serving on the school board, they're serving on the election board. One of these women is also a game warden as well. So she's kind of like the law in town, right? So when there's issues to be dealt with, she's the woman that you're going to deal with. And these are the women that I've found found so far. I do believe that there may be more because I haven't quite exhausted looking at all the documents that I need to look at. The office that women most commonly ran for in the territorial and early statehood period, though, was the office of the county superintendent of public schools. And I don't know if you can read that document to your right there, but that's a list of all of the counties of Wyoming in 1877, the names of all of the county superintendents of schools. And if you look at it, you can see that all of them except for 1 is a woman. All right. So basically, after about 1880, women are running Wyoming's public education system. They're about 85% of the teachers, but they are also the officials in charge. Okay, and I think, sometimes people ask me, what's the most important legacy of women's suffrage in Wyoming? And I think certainly one of them is Wyoming's excellent public education system, of which I am a product. All right. Just in case you think county superintendent of schools was a cushy, easy job that you just sat at a desk and supervised the teachers, it was not. This is from Kyra Simpson and her report about what it was like for her on the job. In the 21 months I have engaged in the work of the County Superintendent of Schools, I have traveled 1,992 miles, written 1,759 letters, sent out 310 circulars and notices, kept in touch with the teachers, receiving from the teachers in the county a monthly report of their work. So your job as county superintendent of school was every year you had to go to each school. You had to physically go to every rural school in Wyoming, every teeny tiny little schoolhouse on some ranch somewhere that had 5 students. You had to go out there, you had to inspect the school, train the teachers, look at the curriculum that they were using, and then also run teachers' institutes, in this case, in her case, in Laramie, where she brought in all the teachers and did a yearly training with them. So 1,900 miles, most of which, of course, would have been on horseback back in those days. So this was not a cushy job by any stretch. All right, so I'm almost done here. I just want to talk about a couple more events, and then we'll kind of wrap up. But I do want to talk for a moment just about Wyoming statehood. So by the 1880s, women's suffrage is pretty well established in Wyoming. It's not controversial. You have women serving in public office. Not a lot of women. It's not like women are taking over the state or anything, but there are certain roles where women are kind of running things, right? So in 1889, Wyoming decides that it wants to apply for statehood, and the process for that is that in Wyoming or in whatever state its territory is applying, you have to have a constitutional convention, you write a constitution, you submit that to Congress, Congress votes yes or no, okay? So in 1889, Wyoming has its constitutional convention, and one day at this convention, there's this one guy who stands up and says, hey, you know what? If we put women's suffrage in the Constitution, that might be too controversial, and Congress might not approve our Constitution. So you know what, maybe we leave women's suffrage out, and then we can just vote on it later. There is a riot, okay? So there's a couple of guys who stand up and say, yeah, I agree with that, but they are quickly shut down because there are many more men at the Constitution, including Esther Morris's son, who are there to say, no, women's suffrage has been great for Wyoming, we're gonna keep women's suffrage, we'll just fight through Congress if that's what we need to do, okay? Now the women also get word of this. And in particular, folks go down and talk to a woman named Therese Jenkins, whose great-great-granddaughter is actually here with us today. And Therese Jenkins is a fire-breathing activist that we have in Wyoming at the time. She's one of the leaders of the Wyoming WCTU. She's very active in many causes in Wyoming. And she gets word that there's a possibility that the men might shut down women's suffrage. So the story goes that she and her husband hitch up their carriage and they travel around town talking to all of the women in the community saying, hey, you need to get down there because the guys are threatening to disenfranchise us. And then apparently what happens is that all of the women head down to the Constitutional Convention to stage a protest and let the men know, no. This is not happening. You're not taking our power away from us. Now, my understanding is that as she is in this carriage doing all of this, she is also very pregnant with her 3rd child. And the story that I've heard goes that she shortly afterwards goes into labor and gives birth to her 3rd daughter, who is named Agnes Wyoming Jenkins. All right, now the guy who stood up at the convention wasn't totally wrong because Wyoming does keep women's suffrage in its constitution, but there actually is a lot of opposition in Congress, okay, particularly from people in the South, because this is the Jim Crow era, right? So those southern states, what they're doing at the same time that Wyoming is trying to pass a constitution expanding voting rights, these southern states are passing constitutions which are disenfranchising black men, and they're really not enthusiastic about the idea of women voting. And so there's a lot of protest from the southern states in Congress, so there's hours and hours of debate in which the South stands up and says, we can't let these crazy Westerners in. I've just picked out a couple of representative quotes for you, but there are many, many more of these if you want to go read this kind of stuff. So the first guy is Senator George Vest, who had been a member of the Confederate Congress and is now back in the US Congress. He says, I believe that with universal suffrage in this country, the injecting into our suffrage of all the women of the United States would be the greatest calamity that could possibly happen to our institutions and people. So nothing could possibly be worse than women voting. And then there's this other former Confederate guy who says, I like a woman who's a woman and who appreciates the sphere to which God and the Bible have assigned her. I do not like a man-woman. All right, so there's lots and lots and lots of this, many, many pages of this in the congressional report if you happen to want to read a bunch of this kind of stuff. But basically, the South doesn't have the votes. They are unable to prevent Wyoming from becoming a state, and so Wyoming does. And so in July of 1890, there is a huge statehood celebration here in Cheyenne. These are the Girl Guards. There are 2 companies of Girl Guards who train to march in the suffrage parade to represent the women of Wyoming. So, there's a parade that day. And then at the end of the parade, there is a speaker's platform where, again, we encounter Teresa Jenkins. She is the keynote speaker of the day. So on the platform, we have Esther Morris, who hands a flag that the Women of Wyoming has made to the governor, Francis Warren. And then Teresa Jenkins gives the keynote speech, and it's a wonderful speech, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it to you because I think it lays out the women's agenda that I see a lot of women, Jenkins and others, kind of pursuing in this era, not just in Wyoming, but in the American West in general. We ask of our lawmakers just laws for the enlargement and perpetuity of our educational facilities, so public schools and the University of Wyoming, that's what she's talking about there. We ask of our legislators wise and magnanimous measures for the erection and maintenance of our benevolent institutions. Here she's talking about things like libraries, hospitals, and a home that is shortly after statehood, she's behind some legislation that establishes a home for young women who wish to leave the sporting life, the brothels that are common here in Cheyenne, women who want to get out of that life. She establishes a home for those women, and then the state actually kind of takes that over after statehood. And then the final paragraph, we ask of you laws for the better protection of the moral as well as the physical natures of our girls and boys. And what she's talking about here is an issue that was very important to women in this era, and it's going to be a major political movement among women in this late 1800s and early 1900s, and that is the movement around the age of protection, which today we call the age of consent, okay? So in Wyoming, the original age of consent was 10 years. Yes, it was 10. Thanks to the efforts of Teresa Jenkins and the women that she was allied with in the 1880s, that was changed to 14. And then shortly after statehood, one of the very first laws that the state of Wyoming passed was a law changing the age of consent to 18. And Wyoming is one of the first states to do this. You want to really hear something gross? In Delaware, the age of consent was 7. Yes. So this was a major focus of the women's rights movement, just to leave Wyoming for a second. The very first law ever written by a woman that passes in a legislature is a bill by Carrie Clyde Hawley in Colorado, which raises the age of consent there. So this was like the first issue that women politicians really engage on when they get political power. Okay, and that kind of just brings me to my last couple slides, where I just really want to emphasize, we've talked today about what's happening in Wyoming, but I just want to emphasize the importance of Wyoming for the national and even the international women's suffrage movement. This is a list of the officers of the National Women's Suffrage Association. You can see three of the women on this particular list are from Wyoming, 2 from Cheyenne. And one is Esther Morris's niece, Julia Brown. And Esther Morris herself is also an officer, but she's on a different page than this. So women play important leadership roles in the national suffrage organizations. When those organizations are lobbying Congress, or when they are lobbying in other states to pass suffrage laws, they're always passing out pamphlets like this, Testimony from Wyoming. You can see Joseph Carey, Governor Bryant Brooks, Francis Warren talking about how great women's suffrage is, and hey, you guys in Kansas ought to adopt it, or you good folks in New York, you ought to put women's suffrage into your constitutions, and so you can be like Wyoming, because we're cool. All right. And then, of course, Wyoming provides many important activists who travel the country taking part in suffrage campaigns. So on the left there, you can see Therese Jenkins from here in Cheyenne traveling to Kansas in 1894 on a speaking platform with Carrie Chapman Catt to support a referendum in Kansas to gain women the right to vote. It's not a successful campaign, but it is one of the many in which she participated. I think she participated in a grand total of something like 12 or 13 different campaigns in different states around the country. And then on the right-hand side, this is a flyer for Connecticut, urging the Connecticut legislature to ratify the 19th Amendment. And you can see on there that one of the speakers is Dr. Grace Raymond Hebard, who is one of the founders of the University of Wyoming, who played a very important leadership role in the early days of the University of Wyoming. Wyoming's influence was also international. This is a letter congratulating the women of Wyoming in 1891 for entering the Union as the first suffrage state. This letter is from British suffragists. I have also seen reference to Wyoming suffragists in New Zealand, in documents in India, in France, and kind of all over the world. Women's suffragist organizations point to Wyoming as this sterling, shining example of what everything a modern government should be. So I just want to leave you with one last quote from Esther Morris. This is from a letter that she wrote to her niece when her niece was kind of at a crisis point in her life and trying to make some decisions about what she should do. And this is the advice that Esther gave her, and I think that this really kind of is her philosophy of life in a lot of ways. I say, do all the good you can while you do live. And I just want to close by saying that because women like Esther Morris, like Therese Jenkins, had the courage to stand up and do all the good that they could in their lives, we are all able to live the lives that we are living today. And so we should be grateful to them, and I think we should also be asking ourselves, what is it that we need to be doing so that future generations can preserve the same opportunities we'd have and perhaps have more. All right, so that's all. Thank you very much.